Skydio stands at the forefront of autonomous drone technology in the United States, innovating with advanced AI to deliver drones tailored for law enforcement and governmental applications. Established in 2014, our expertise spans AI, robotics, and electrical vehicle technologies, enabling us to craft the most intelligent flying machines that enhance public safety and operational efficiency. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Well, I'm sure we can all recall an incident where dozens of rounds were fired at critical incidents, some legitimate in response to real threats, but some may be reactive, reflective, maybe even called sympathy fire, or now I'm hearing contagious fire. Well, evidence-based policing has contributed to the efforts to legitimize policing efforts by means of assessments and evaluations and studies. A recent study by a cohort of law enforcement professional researchers, academics, and hybrids of the discipline have produced a paper called An Experimental Test of the Contagious Fire Thesis in Policing. Well, about time. I think we're way overdue for an update here. They introduce it as, quote, the thesis posits that in the deadly force scenarios, police officers are prone to use their firearms and discharge more rounds following the catalyst of peer officer gunfire. This should be an interesting discussion. Our guests today are veterans. They are John DeCarlo, retired chief and professor in criminal justice at the Henry C. Lee College. Welcome, Chief.
That's a tongue twister, and thank you for having us, Jim. It's great to be here.
Yeah, nice talking to you, and can't wait to hear what you have to say. Chief Steve Hebbe of the Farmington Police in New Mexico. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you. Appreciate the invite and look forward to the discussion.
And Eric Dlugolenski, assistant professor at the Connecticut State University. Welcome.
Jim, welcome. Thank you for having us. We look forward to it.
All right. And returning guest, I think this might be your third time, Chief Jason Potts, Public Safety Director in Las Vegas.
Thanks, Jim. Honored to be here.
Well, I've read the article, so impressive, and all the work done to cover all the bases. You talk about it in your abstract. You list all of the measures used in your methods sections, and you have a pretty good conclusion and some really important things to think about in the future. What was the catalyst for this study? Who was the lead proponent to say, hey, we need to look at this?
Well, Jim, I think what happened was it was a consensus call. Chief Hebbe had in New Mexico, Farmington, New Mexico, had experienced a bunch of, not a bunch, but several incidents of fire that he believed to be contagious fire. So he was looking for a solution, and there was no empirical validation for contagious fire at the time. Before the experiment, there was a great paper by White and Klinger in 2012 that kind of opened up the argument or the discussion on contagious fire. Chief Hebbe had Nick Bloomfield, one of his sergeants, call us, and we started to talk and decided that this was a great opportunity, again, for practice and academics or researchers to get together and look for answers to pressing questions. You know, we have a lot of vexatious questions in policing. And we did. And after we did the first part of the experiment in New Mexico, Eric and Jason are both Leeds scholars. And so they started to talk. And Jason, as progressive as he is as a boss, said, come out and do the experiment here too. And so we that was the progenitor. That was the kind of the catalyst of how things came together.
Chief Hebbe?
So we I've been chief here now for a little over 10 years, and we had a number of shootings during those years. And the volume of shots fired by our officers was reasonably predictable. It was in that 3 to 5 range per officer in these incidents. And we had a shooting a few summers back now, all of a sudden, where we fired 40 some rounds, and I had 5 officers opening up. And so some of those officers were 10 rounds and more. And so the question that I was asking our staff is, how do we get to this? This isn't the way we train, and we don't train to fire like that. And it's an abnormality from everything else we've experienced. And I'm a big one that when police supervisors are looking at events like this, we should be asking ourselves hard questions and then seeing if we can come up with the answer. And we couldn't come up with an answer that moved me past. It has to be a function of the number of officers involved in the incident. Because when I have 1 or 2 officers, we're right along with our training, or right along with everything we've experienced up till then. But here we have 5 officers involved in it, and the shot volume is way higher than anything we train. So we began reaching out to other agencies. Have they experienced anything like this? And what kind of training and what kind of results have they seen when they've actually studied it? And it's just not a strength in law enforcement, unfortunately. That's why I was so happy for John and Eric, and then frankly that Jason joins in. We don't do a good job in law enforcement of studying what are we doing and asking ourselves hard questions. And some of that, I think, is the profession. Chiefs are 3 to 5 years and they move on. I had the chance to be here a little longer, and so I can make partnerships, and we can begin down the path of demonstrating whether that's really something. And to me, all the way back to the Amadou Diallo day, where the officers were firing many rounds at a subject who in the end wasn't even armed. So they believed they were being fired at. And so to me, it's a logical thing that the number of officers, the number of gunshots going on affects the officer and his decision making. But we need to be able to see that and prove it. And then once we do, come up with a way of training to improve our performance so that we're not winging rounds all over the place. It's a public safety, as well as, like Jason I think is going to talk about. It's also an officer career saver, that we are firing when we need to fire and only what we need to fire. And so I think John and Eric's study will have monumental impact on policing down the road.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up a good point, but when we have these incidents, and I think most departments have had them, where multiple shots are fired, what about a post shooting debriefing or a shooting investigation team? Chief Potts, did you look at any of those to see what was a good process for evaluating or questions to ask officers post shooting at a debrief?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jim. I think, adding to the profession here and doing this, other sectors do a good job with this, right? The airline industry with checklists and near misses, the medical profession, and I would say the SWAT teams, right? Oftentimes in SWAT, we debrief a lot of these incidents. It's not always about being outcome based. It's also about the process and how you got there, and did you make a mistake, and owning those mistakes. And I think this study, as Chief Hebbe just talked about, is this might save an officer's career, with the why this happened. So I'm looking forward to John and Eric just talking about the implications here. But yeah, we can do much better. And we're just honored to be able to participate and contribute to the profession. Really, our folks now understand, the studies and evidence-based decision-making, and doing a pilot, and the value of strong relationships and partnerships, and implementation of evidence-based policing or evidence-based decision-making in action. Not just a loaded term, but they get to see it in real life. And so it was a real value for our organization and our folks.
Yeah, so you sat around the table. Eric, maybe you could frame it for us. When you thought about how to conduct the study, you went ahead and simulated scenarios. You used simulations, excuse me, and you chose officers from several agencies. You had a subject pool of 169 officers that you showed the videos, or how'd that work?
Sure. So really what made this research possible is how organic it was, right? Because those are all hard questions, is how do you team up with practitioners and make this realistic enough that it's game speed and actually, not just a simulation, but a simulation that's very accurate. So I really want to give, some acknowledgement where it's due, because Sergeant Nick Bloomfield of Farmington worked with us directly as a project coordinator there. And essentially we walked through a number of iterations until we felt confident, basically with a video scenario and a dispatch priming script that really put the officer in that kind of, classic go, no go situation, right? They weren't given enough information really to make a decision, but they were given some alarm based on Paul Taylor's dispatch priming research to get them in a situation where firing was likely. But we basically had to create that simulation where it was almost like a coin toss, right? We'd expect kind of like a 50-50 the way we designed it. And then the intervention in kind of classic psychological experiments is what we call confederates. So we actually had two people that were in on it, and there was some deception here. We went through my university's IRB for that. But we did tell the officers that we were basically just going to monitor and record the action-reaction gap and their decision-making process and the timeline for that. So we told them we were recording the firing line to see those things. In reality, we're really recording the firing line because we need an order of operations. We need to know who fired first, second, third, because that matters for the inquiry. So that's some of the background. I don't know if, John, you want to kind of elaborate a little further.
I think that what we were looking for, thanks, Eric. I think what we were looking for is a way to construct, as Eric alluded to, an effective and realistic scenario that happens. Cops are out there, and very often they don't have all the information. Things are happening rapidly. Eric referred to that as game speed. I think that what we were looking to do was recreate that situation. And ultimately, what we found out were a couple of things that were based on the success of working with Farmington and refining even more with Las Vegas. And so I think that that's why the situation yielded the results that it did. It was proof, final proof that, yeah, this does happen. We weren't sure. We had a lot of speculation, but a connection, a research connection between practice and academics is something that's hard to do. And policing in the United States, and I know that everyone will agree with me, doesn't have a research arm. There's not a national research arm. And the grants that, the wonderful grants that NIJ and Department of Justice gives out are, when you talk 700,000 cops in the country, they're kind of far and few between. And so this is what a connection between practice and research does.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the naysayers or the critics who say, well, you know what, it's a video, everybody knows it's not real, they're going to react differently. I got to tell you, in my experience, in my career, every time I went into a FATS machine, it was like the real deal, right? You go into a firearms simulation, if you're lackadaisical, you're shot, the video kills you, and nobody wants that. So set me up a little bit. So how many officers at a time would you have come into this scenario? 2, 3, 4 more?
Eric, you wanna field this?
Sure. It's probably important to give the listener more of a kind of background, right? So part of the deception in this is any, law enforcement officer, police officer listening to this, they know, cops talk, right? So anywhere we piloted this, ran the study, had to be kind of a quick in and out, because if we were there for too long, you can immediately see it would bias because somebody leaves. Eventually they start kind of getting to the background of it. So basically, if you're one of the officers coming in, you're told that you have, some sort of training, you come in off the road. Dr. DeCarlo and I were there for, a couple days at each site, and we would try and catch every shift. So we would start, 7 a.m. and run till 11, or when John told me he wanted to go home. But we would basically go all day, and it took about a half hour to get each person through it. So we had our two Confederates. They're the two officers that are completely briefed on the situation. We were very careful to make sure that there was no kind of like deference going on. So these were not ranking officers or people that you'd expect, behavior to maybe change for, just because if this person does this, I have to act in a certain way, right? You can imagine if, Chief Potts were on the firing line and you have a rookie officer, maybe they're just going to follow his behavior because, the chief's next to me. So we were careful to mitigate that. And really what broke this through was we use these simunition conversion kits that basically create that professional cap gun sound. So we wanted the direct feedback, the recoil. We wanted this to feel exactly like the officer's duty weapon. And that's hard to do in VR. That's hard to do. A lot of these technologies just aren't at a point where we can create that yet. So actually using the secure blank loud rounds from simunition gave that real powerful, like you had to obviously have, eye and ear protection in there because you're getting all the feedback. The only thing that's not happening is we're not having a projectile actually go down range. So we're recreating all the things that might point to a startle response or some of the other kind of things we look at in terms of what might cause this or what might be the mechanism behind it. But John and I, we set out to empirically understand if it actually exists, right? Because before this study, it was all about, anecdotes, just a constellation of practitioner anecdotes. Everybody goes to the range master. It's talked about by the use of force instructor, but it's all anecdote, right? So the way we set it up was your two Confederate officers or role players. They're basically there waiting as if they've already filled out all their paperwork and they're just waiting to go. The officer that comes in that is blind to what's going on and thinks they're going to a training, we explain to them that, hey, we're looking at the action reaction gap. We're going to record you going through a number of scenarios. We just want to see, how you react. There's no, right answer, just based on your training experience, assume the tactical position that you would in real life and kind of go through it how you would, totality of circumstances, all that. We go through informed consent, all the kind of research forms we have to fill out. We have a survey to get all their background demographics that might be related or things we want to look at later. And then we escort them to location 2. Location 2 is kind of like a waiting room where the two Confederates are. And they were really good at all sites about kind of playing the role and hanging out with their paper. Like, all right, can we go now, right? I'm like, all right, we have 3, so we can bring you in. And we bring them into the next room. There's 3 simunition kits laid out. They're all preloaded. So we had a certain number of rounds in each firearm. I believe it was 3 for each of the Confederates. And we fully loaded the magazine for the test subject, right? So we bring them in, then we have 3 spots on the ground. So the Confederates we always put on the left and the right. We put the test subject in the middle. And in reality, they're all getting the exact same scenario, right? So they're all getting the same video. It's a despondent, emotionally disturbed person, says they want to kill themselves, frightens the store clerk. Store clerk says they're going to call 911. And I'm paraphrasing this at this point, so you can kind of read the paper to get the exact script. But essentially, you have the idea that someone is possibly armed, knows police are coming, and is leaving the back of the building. When officers start, we turn off the lights to kind of create the environment. We record the firing line, and they start off going right around this side of a building, and they appear in a situation where there's the subject matching the description, and they start going through their progressions as they would. And that's basically the setup. After each one, we would debrief the officer in a second room. We did some interviewing stuff with them for maybe some follow-up research to see, what their kind of recall was in terms of the whole scenario. And then we'd have them exit. And we really were at sites fast enough that we'd go through as many officers as we could. And that's why we went to, 3 different states and 11 different departments, is because each one was a fresh, unbiased group to pull from.
And I just want to add that whether the Confederate shot or not was random. So we used a random number generator so that it actually occurred randomly, just like it would in the field. We don't know if someone is going to start shooting or not. And to give you an idea of the depth of the logistics, we did 169 individual scenarios, which were snowball sampled because Jason and Steve both got us other departments to come in and work with us. But all in all, with 169 scenarios, that's 507 personnel, and of course the Confederates were the same Confederates in most cases. But that's a lot of logistics, a lot of moving parts that we had to deal with and keep the secret.
Yeah, well, it's out now. Sorry. And the Confederate, the use of the Confederate sounds like the old Milgram obedience experiments. And yeah, that's fascinating. Where the apparently the test subjects were in on it afterwards. That the Confederates were there to prompt them.
Yeah, the Confederates are the think of the Confederate fire as the stimulus to fire or not to fire. So we wanted to see, what we wanted to measure was what happened when the Confederate stimulus did fire to the officers. And Eric and I have had a million conversations along with both chiefs. You know, is it going back to psychological heuristics, you know, and about the availability heuristic, not having enough information, the fire starting, giving you the information. This is all speculative at this time. We don't know. Is it social contagion? Like Eric uses the metaphor of clapping at a performance, and everyone starts clapping. So we don't really know why at this point. We know it happens. So now our next set of experiments will try to find out why it happens, so then we could eventually and ultimately reduce the error rate.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. What were the commonalities? What did the test subjects say? I mean, I got to think that some are firing because they assume that the person next to them sees something that they don't, or they don't want to be that guy who everybody fires but them. I don't think they want to be that guy. My son, who just got promoted to sergeant yesterday for the San Francisco PD.
Congratulations.
Thank you. He was telling me about a shooting where apparently one of the cops is shooting over the top of you couldn't even see what he's shooting at, but everybody, I mean, there were multiple cops firing in a situation. And I guess there's that fear of being, well, why didn't you shoot? Well, everybody else shot. Why didn't you shoot?
Jim, that's a great point. I mean, think back in our career, those officers that sometimes that didn't shoot in those critical incidents, sometimes they're the ones that deal with it harder than the officers that did shoot because they second guess themselves. And so there's some interesting psychology. But I had a question for John and Eric. Did you guys find anything about some of the participants? I know we had some tenured officers and sergeants that participated as well. And you guys saw some interesting things there, right? That folks were following them based on tenure and who they were, the informal leaders and that kind of thing.
Eric, you want to talk about a little bit about what Jason is asking, and also about what some of the demographics that we recorded with the officers, as far as military, SRT, things like that.
Definitely. Yes, we captured all basic demographics, right? Anything that might be pertinent, right? So tenure, rank, special weapons training, whether that's ERT, SRT, SWAT, and then prior military experience, right, for different sorts of weapons handling. And we brought all those things in as things we can look at in future analyses.
Sleep.
Oh yeah. We also looked at their sleep, how many shifts they've worked in the last week. So we'll be doing some follow-up analyses just to look at if fatigue plays in it all. And then also John mentioned talking about rank, right? So this is purely anecdotal. I can say it kind of in a podcast format. It's not empirical. It's not something we put in, a scientific journal. But just watching the officers go through, we anecdotally did observe some sort of pattern that if someone had chevrons, so sergeants, they tended to communicate first and kind of take that leadership command position. And again, I'm speaking just in like my own, kind of biased observation of watching it. We definitely don't have a big enough sample size to empirically, it's a future study, right? But we did notice that sergeants tended to take more command. And this goes back to the reports in the aftermath of, the final shooting in the boat in the Boston bombing, right? Because John and I couldn't even locate the number of rounds that were fired during that incident, because we really wanted to know for, our background here, because that's one of the biggest, multi-shot, multi-officer incidents recorded. But if you look at the reports that came out in the aftermath of that, one of the recommendations was to advance micro commands, which is basically teaching your officers to work in situations where someone's going to take point, kind of like, the sergeants seem to do naturally just as we're watching it. So again, do we have evidence to really kind of push that forward? No, but it's definitely something that's piquing our interest as, one of many possible sort of like antidotes to the error, right?
Mhm.
And
Any commonalities in the years of experience or recent training, or what types of training?
the demographics did not show many statistical differences that rose to the level of being important. But again, anecdotally, Eric and I interviewed everyone as they came off the line, and I remember one individual, Eric. I'm sure we were standing there together, and one individual was a senior officer. He might have been a sergeant, and he didn't shoot. He was one of the few, because we have to talk yet about the actual number of people and the difference between when the Confederates shot and when they didn't, because it was a huge difference.
Hmm.
But this guy didn't shoot when the Confederates shot, and we said, well, why didn't you shoot? And he said, well, I've been a cop a long time, and I've seen a lot of people stick their hands in their pockets. And I thought, I'm not going to kill this guy for sticking his hands in his pocket. Now, there could be arguments on both sides to that statement, but it was a reason that we had not heard before. It slowed time down. Eric's response before about game speed. I think some officers may have the ability to slow things down, and that's an important thing that cops could learn to do. Not putting their own selves in danger, but slowing things down so that we reduce an error rate. There's a lot to talk about here, and I was wondering, we haven't talked about the actual numbers of what happens when the Confederates shoot, and think of Confederates as the other cops on scene. Eric, if it's okay, Jim, if you think it's time to talk about that, I'd like
Sure.
Eric to kind of just tell you that, I mean, these massively significant numbers.
Sure.
Definitely. So just in our line of work, it's a really large effect sizes, right? Like we don't typically see these things. And you mentioned, sample size is something. Do you have any concerns with 169 going through? And definitely not on our end. That definitely meets the requirements. And just with the effect sizes we're seeing, even at a small level, we'd only expect that to go further. So just to give you kind of the top line results, when the intervention was present, and the intervention means the catalyst, the two peer officers, the Confederates, are both going to fire all 3 rounds when the individual reaches for their waistband, right? So in the video, there's some directives given. They're kind of non-cooperative, non-compliant, and then there's a very, I hate the term, right? The kind of police jargon, but that very furtive kind of movement to the pocket, pulls up like you would if you were taking a shooting stance, and it's a cell phone. And we looked at the frame rate of the video. I would shoot, right? I would shoot as a former sergeant with the background information, the priming, the way it's reaching, the way it's coming up. So really, we had to debrief officers afterwards to explain to them that there wasn't a right decision to this. We are very apologetic. We purposely put you in a no-win situation because we want to see if this one other variable has anything to do with your decision. So again, all these officers go through the exact same scenario. The only thing that changes is whether or not the two role-playing officers are going to fire. They act the same, they take the same positions, but whenever they got an even number in our random number generator, they fire. So basically think of it like a clinical trial, randomized, whether or not you're getting the actual intervention. And the intervention at this point, again, was they fire 3 rounds. So looking at the classic contagious fire thesis, there's 2 dependent variables we're interested in. The first is just that dichotomous or binary variable, did they shoot, did they not shoot, right? So kind of zeros and ones. The second is the count of how many rounds did they fire, because we also, one of our hypotheses was we expected the volume of rounds fired to go up in the presence of that catalyst. So looking at those 2 things, just top line results, and again, this is across all sites. Essentially, officers were over 11 times more likely to fire their weapons. And again, you would exponentiate the log odds. You can think of that as over 1,000%. And then there's 72% more rounds were fired in the presence of peer officer gunfire. So again, in our, kind of like the ivory tower of, police science, whatever you want to call it, we don't see effect sizes that big. So we were very careful with this. We went back in, we matched groups. We did some more kind of sophisticated modeling to make sure that randomization wasn't something that affected it. But at this point, we have very strong empirical evidence to support what I think is, something practitioners have alluded to for a long time. Media outlets have alluded to. Every time we have one of these situations, you can pull up the Google search right now. You'll see contagious fire and somebody describing kind of what it means, but no research to actually say, hey, it's a thing. Your officers need to be aware of it. And the next step is, mitigation.
Yeah. So in the scenarios, it was the same video for everyone.
Yeah. And we had originally thought, oh, this would be a great opportunity to measure if there were other differences in suspect demographics, and but by diminishing or splitting the size between one demographic profile and another demographic profile in the suspects, that would lower the number of random tests that we had and lower the statistical power. So we decided to go, we were measuring the contagion effect. We weren't measuring social, many other things that we could. And we did that because, as you alluded to before, 169 took us over a year to get. And it was a lot of work. And then, we would have needed more than double the number of research subjects to be able to make a call on adding another variable in. So that's why we didn't do that. So they didn't know it was the same. We told them it was different every time, or, every 5th time. But we went with just one scenario that we recorded with Sergeant Bloomfield in Farmington, and it was a great. Interestingly, the person that was in it was neither black nor white. They were indigenous, and a person from the Navajo Nation who was also a police officer. So we kind of landed on one profile, one demographic profile, and because we wanted to have everyone exposed to the exact same person.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about what's on the minds of everyone in policing these days, and that's de-escalation. But first, I want to thank our sponsor. Take a quick break. Every incident demands quick, informed decisions, but limited resources and constantly changing environments make this tough. Join us at Skydio Ascend 2024 to see how drone as first responder technology enhances decision-making and improves officer and community safety. Hear from leading agencies using DFR as a force multiplier and learn how they're shaping the future of public safety. This virtual event streams live on September 25th and 26th. Get your free ticket at skydio.com/ascend. That's skydio.com/ASCEND. And we're back, and I'm speaking with Professor John DeCarlo. John DeCarlo, retired Chief Professor of Criminal Justice, Chief Jason Potts from Las Vegas, Chief Steve Hebbe from Farmington, New Mexico, and Eric Dlugolenski, Assistant Professor at Connecticut State University. We're talking about the contagious shooting fire study that they did that looks at why officers fire multiple rounds, or why they fire when other officers are firing, talking about the experiment. And I alluded to de-escalation. Were there opportunities for the officers to shout out warnings or commands? Were there things that they could position themselves behind as cover or concealment in these situations? Eric?
Sure. I'll start out, and then definitely John will jump in here. So when we look at things like de-escalation and we talk about an event like this, again, in the research, we consider this the final frame of a use of force, right? So even in the simulation, we put officers, we didn't give them these chances, right? So it was stacked against them. It was not fair in a sense that they didn't have the ability to retreat. They didn't have the ability to go for cover. So time, distance, cover were essentially off the table, because we're understanding that force is incredibly rare, and we had to prime and create a situation where it was, again, back to that kind of a coin flip scenario.
Shoot, don't shoot.
And I would go and very carefully word this, and I would say de-escalation has an absolute place here, but it's in the earlier stages that can lead up to that final frame. But that's really where the fertile ground is, because at where we are right now is we are seeing a very high error rate that we can show empirically just based on the stimulus, right? We don't necessarily have the exact mechanism pinned down yet, but in terms of practitioners out on the road tomorrow, this is a variable you now know exists and you have to be aware of. The problem is, if you are in that final position, and I know Chief Potts talks about this, like, right, where are your feet, right? Where have you ended up in this, kind of chain of events? Because once you get to a certain point, de-escalation is not going to be something that is, on the table. So we can talk about it in the earlier frames. And I think John talks a lot about kind of like accident theory too, and how this is looked at from aviation. And that's probably something we should kind of lay the groundwork for here. John?
Yeah, and so we don't, as Eric said, and I know that both chiefs are proponents of, is de-escalation is extremely important, slowing things down in policing, and that's exactly what de-escalation does. We go in, our adrenaline is up, and there's all kinds of things happening anatomically, physiologically. So that could have a great effect, and it's something that some amount of de-escalation at the beginning stages of this could mitigate to a degree. But in my other life, I'm a flight instructor, and I've been teaching flying for lots of more years than I care to reveal. And so I've studied what the FAA has done to reduce errors, and I find that pilots and cops very often get in these exigent, messy situations. Everyone has heard the just before the plane hits the ground, the last thing that the pilot says is, "Oh crap," and realizing that there's no coming back from the error chain. And we have this thing in aviation called the accident chain. It's like you could change what happens at the end at many instances during the event. And so if it gets to the point of having to shoot and then having to shoot in front of other people and having it affect them, we have to look at a lot of variables, more than we have in this instantiation of the experiment. And but it's about error. When we have an excessive use of force, unless we're talking about psychopathy and someone who likes to hurt people, which is, not the case here. We're talking about error rate. We're talking about slowing things down enough, from the standpoint of taking control of the situation and reducing the intensity of it and understanding it better, all the way to training cops to behave differently based on existing information. Now, I know I was a cop for 35 years, and so I think we're all Jason and Steve are still cops. Eric and I are retired cops, and but we all know that sometimes stuff happens so quickly. And Jim, I've had the conversation with you about thinking about, is this guy next to me going to shoot, and trying to talk them out of it. So sometimes things are just moving so fast, and you just get out of your car that there may or may not be a control. But we think that since the FAA has been very successful in reducing, with scheduled airlines, the 121 operations, reducing the accident rate, and this is irrespective of doors flying off, airplanes, but that's a mechanical problem. Their pilots are trained to slow things down, and they're trained in simulators to make that happen over and over again. So we have to find out more about the causal elements of contagious fire in order to apply knowledge, real-time knowledge, to train cops out of excessive force, because at that point, we're cops, we use force, and sometimes, most times, when a cop uses force, it's necessary, but when the contagion happens, that is not necessarily even a thing. But there's so little time and so many cops and so many questions about social contagion, about heuristics, about startle reflex, hundreds of things. So our next round of research is going to take us in several different areas, and to try to find out what causes it, so we could give cops the benefit of getting trained in the academy and in recurrent training to take control of situations, just like FAA did with scheduled airlines, and stop error rates. So it's interesting. Eric, Jason, Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what we're going to talk about next is what is next, right? For the implication of the profession, like training, for example, firearms training, what we do traditionally, typically on the static line, we yell threat and our officers fire, and we don't always incorporate shoot, no shoot. We don't incorporate backdrops, failure drills, manipulation drills, just reality-based training, and virtual reality training can help us with that. And I often think about the conditioning, like we condition our cops, and our cops are always very action oriented. And if you think about when you're a young cop and our folks, 3 a.m., you don't want to get on the radio and say, hey, listen, I'm out on this person, and this person's going to fight you. You probably shouldn't be there. It's that officer created jeopardy, right? You're going to go out on this guy that's known to fight, and you're going to get yourself in a jackpot. Or, when we think about heuristics, when you're stopping a guy or a girl and he or she starts to tie their shoes, they pull their pants up. Well, you know what? The cops are going to go, hey, last time that happened, this person ran from me. And so I think that's the meaning behind the heuristics, and why our cops think of these things quite a bit, and why it's so easy to get caught up in that, system 1, system 2 type thinking, and how we mitigate that. So, Chief, you got anything else to add on that?
I think from my perspective, just listening to the discussion on it, and the number of things in policing that we could be studying and looking at, and that kind of goes back to my original comments, that we just haven't been as receptive. And John's also right that the money that comes from the feds goes to specific programs where I can set up a pilot program in my community and run it. But we don't do a good job industry-wide, like we're describing with the FAA and crash reconstruction, of really breaking down a shooting, because the next steps that the chief's talking about, we're already trying to look at, and that's, okay, what's the implications for our training program? And policing, gets to be like any bureaucracy to an extent. We just keep doing the same things over and over. So I started in 1990, and we trained on the range in Anchorage, Alaska, as a police officer. We trained the same way we do today. You line up, everybody has a target, somebody else says fire, and we all begin firing until X time. We're either told we only fire 3 shots, or we're told to stop firing, and then we stop firing. We do it the same. I guarantee Jason does some version very similar to that in his department. Doesn't matter the size of the agency, doesn't matter the region. We still do things essentially the same. And this kind of research really has to get you asking, what are we doing and how can we do it more effectively for our officers?
Yeah, and in a perfect world, we have the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, and act. And it'd be great to have the luxury to do all of that. But in the real world, not so often. Sometimes in armed encounters or other encounters where we're going to have the runner or somebody get physical with us, I could think of situations where officers fired after hearing shots from other officers, just like your study. In one case, I can recall in a really close quarters, I think they were in a false ceiling. One officer fired, felt the ricochet. The second officer felt the ricochet from his bullet come back, perceived they were under fire, and started firing as well. Is it possible? I mean, instinct says we only have 2 options, right? Fight or flight. Is there one in the middle that says hold, wait, learn more? Is it possible to teach our officers to hold back, or is it too dangerous to say hold, hover, get more information?
I think sometimes it's too late, right? And that's why we talk about distance, cover, numbers, option. And if you can leverage time, you'll have that. And so, if you think about some of these situations where cops have been in jackpots, they've gone out on a domestic violence call by themselves, right? And you see it, and then there's a shooting. It's tragic. It's on YouTube. And why didn't they just stage? Why didn't they ask for other officers? And we talked about those officers that are really action oriented. They're hard chargers. They're at 3 a.m. They don't want to wake up their beat partners, right? And so they're going to go out on people and not put it out. Listen, I was that young cop that used to do silly things like that, and I got lucky. I'm telling you, and I've been in fights by myself in some pretty bad areas by myself. And so, our cops do this, and we need to really figure that out, and that's reconstructing what happened and why it happened. And again, learning a lot from the airline industry and why they do it. It's not always outcome based.
Yeah. So what was the reaction like from the participants, from the chiefs? Were they like, what when they finally knew everything that was being studied, what did they say?
I want to just try to answer this. I know that when I was a chief, I was constantly in search of answers to problems that I couldn't solve by myself. And I think that every chief, not just Chief Potts and Chief Hebbe, but all of the other chiefs that had their personnel take part in the study, were all people of a certain ilk. They want to solve problems. They don't want what Chief Hebbe alluded to before. They don't want to do things the same way all the time. It's a younger generation. It's people that are going through and looking at research. The lead scholar program is wonderful because it has an academic and a practitioner component. And I think that contrary to what many people think, I think that this is a time, especially after the hard times that we have had. I think it's a time for a renaissance in how we do policing. I think that we have the potential with partnerships and understanding, new training, new technologies to really change the way policing works. And so it's on us to team up to work at big questions that we don't have answers to. And, you know, right now in the United States, there is no central clearinghouse for research in policing. 700,000 cops, 18,000 some odd departments. And, you know, we're all municipal or state or county, and there's no one really in charge. We're very local. Policing is local, just like politics are local. And I think the opportunity to work together on common problems through even with Eric and I get a kick out of this all the time, because even with when we do get a new piece of technology, it's not cop created, it's not cop researched, it's a private company that says, hey, you know, I think that cops could use this or use that. And, you know, I mean, cops like shiny things, so we're going to try it. And so I think that I would like to get feedback from all of you, Jim, Steve, Jason, and Eric, you know, on where you think that research like this, and not just our research, but important research to improve policing, just like in improve medicine. You know, we don't. Medical people have hospitals that, you know, and research places of research. We don't. What do you think we should do?
Yeah, I love the medical concept of epidemiology, of going to the harm and going backwards and looking at all the cause and influence roots and just dissecting. I think we need to do a better job in debriefings. I think rather than make excuses, I think we need to really, you know, sometimes look at the hard facts. And, you know, I always say when I see these things, and I tell my two sons that are both cops, that when we have these really problematic issues, it usually comes down to training and supervision. So I think we need to add that into the mix of research and evidence-based research, and build it into training, because too often we have great research like this, but it's there if people seek it out. And I think this study should go to every police academy in America, and those agencies should look within and
Jim,
do a really good debriefing post shooting where multiple rounds are fired. Jason.
And Jim, if I could just say something, I think what we're doing here, John, is what we should be doing in the future. And it's I kind of resist this check the box type training, right? Just to say we've done it, and are we baking it, are we infusing it into everything we're doing? And I think all too often in policing, there are capacity issues, there's bandwidth, there's agency culture and values. All those things play a part, unions and associations. But, you know, stop this check the box. Like, you know, we use these loaded terms, procedural justice. Okay, are we fair? Are we transparent? Are we trustworthy in our motives? Okay, great. That's the golden rule. But are we baking it into everything we're doing? And when we talk about contagious fire shooting, it's not difficult to start to do tabletops. These are things that you can do in a lineup. All too often we watch a YouTube video and we condition our officers on a shoot. It's not even a shoot, no shoot. We just say, oh, that cop should have shot that person. I've seen that. I've seen that in lineups. Well, I'll ask my sergeants when in Northern California, like, what's the reason for showing that YouTube video? Is there a reason? And not just to say, well, that cop should have shot. Well, I want to know, did he de-escalate? Did he have enough distance? Where was his feet? And what led up to that? And let's talk about how we got there. That's not just criticize. And you know where I'm going with this as far as the YouTube videos and everything else, but really getting our training squared away and baking it into everything we're doing.
I also think, you know, and I don't want to come off too hard, but I really think our officers will do pretty much whatever we want them to do. They're doing their best at the line level. So when we're looking at things like this, these are leadership questions, right? So when we started calling around the country, other departments had seen the same phenomenon, but nobody had done anything about it. And that is just a loss. And that's a loss that comes from leadership. And so when we're calling around the country to find, you know, any research partners, we wind up over in Connecticut. Well, there's a lot of departments between New Mexico and Connecticut, right? To have them fly out to Connecticut and then eventually on to Las Vegas, there's a lot of departments. So one of the challenges for policing to me is we rotate our leadership, pretty regular. It's 3 to 5 years at the bigger departments like Jason's probably experiencing. Maybe you're up to 7 years at agencies my size. And so within that funnel, then the leader can just be fixated on his time in office and making sure he's explaining to the public what happened in this shooting. Well, yes, and I could in our shooting, the subject had a gun pointed at officers. That's what triggered the firing. But it's the secondary questions. But we acted differently. So although we survived the shooting politically, we could explain it to the public, and it was a justified shooting. All the subsequent questions also needed to be asked. And honestly, when you're looking at this, it isn't a new phenomenon. It's been going on for decades, and we really haven't done any research on it. So as law enforcement leadership, we've got to do a better job of reaching out and finding these academic partners to help us ask questions.
100%.
Research partners are important. Even this is pie in the sky type stuff, but embedded researcher, if you will, and that's the LEADS program. And a shout out to that, right? LEADS is Law Enforcement Advanced in Data and Science, and it's a cohort across the country. There's lots of folks out there. These American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, a shameful plug there for them and what they do. But they, there's all kinds of outlets out there. George Mason University and some of those top-notch researchers. So it's out there. I would encourage our audience to seek it out. It's there.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be great for the Department of Justice, who's famous for consent decrees, to get out in front of problems and start issuing grants and RFPs for research and things like that.
Don't wait till the end after the damage is done.
Right.
I mean, don't get me wrong, consent decrees at some point are necessary, and but let's not wait until we've gotten to the point where we have done damage to a community and then try to get in front of the problem. Let's get in front of the problems that exist at the beginning, and try to train cops. I want to recommend a book to anyone who's listening that we're all looking to select cops now. That's become a big issue in the United States. And there's a book called Research on Police Selection. It's by a retired professor named Michael Amodt, Aamodt, and he did all these meta studies on how to select the best people to be police officers. Don't just give them the MMPI-2, but do other tests and look at different groups of interest and things like that. And it is kind of an amazing little book. It costs like $30, and I think it's the kind of book that every chief should have on their bedside stand.
Well, I'm going to counter that, Chief. I'm working on a book. It's actually in publishing right now with Janae Gasparini. She's a New York cop and academic there, and it's on looking at the next Generation Z of recruits and all the things that we're doing, and of the PERF report, the IAC report, IACP, and others. I don't think we do enough, and not to say we're lowering standards, but to look at the needs, the learning process, and the interests of people that are right now resisting recruiting. And we hope to come out with that before October, before IACP. And I'm going to make it $29.99 just to beat your book.
I want a signed copy.
For sure. Hey, I want to wrap it up, respective of your time. I just want to ask, I know researchers are protective of their research, but I want to ask, we're talking a lot lately. I went to the Axon conference in Miami a month or so ago, and looking at all the new technology. Virtual reality is so real, and it gives you the opportunity for really low-cost repetition in training. Can VR be used in looking at this kind of thing in contagious shooting, fire? Is it possible? Can a larger study be used to look at existing body-worn camera footage from multiple firing incidents? What's your opinion?
Jason did a paper on VR. in training. So I think that he's the guy that should be speaking to it.
Yeah, we did. And virtual reality and dispatch priming. I would just say when we did that study, it was a bit cartoonish. It didn't really give us anything. It showed that we could do this randomized control trial, and it did work. And I would just say this. So I had a thought, and I would encourage our audience and those folks at the federal law enforcement training centers of the world and these major academies, that this is a laboratory. I would encourage them to start actually looking at this. And, our courageous cops deserve better. They deserve us to look at this stuff. And I applaud everybody that's here on this panel that we're doing this. We're informing the profession, and our cops deserve nothing but that. They're out there doing it, and if it saves one cop's career, this is going to be a win. And I would encourage that federal law enforcement training center to start being involved in this. That is a laboratory. They could do these things and really inform the profession. And how do we know something works? We don't unless we target, test, and track it. And I would just say, let's get after it. Let's get after it, guys and girls.
Chief Hebbe, any final remarks?
I think, Jim, you had a good point, and I think that Chief Potts is kind of echoing that. I think the DOJ could take a more active role in, and even if it was quarterly or monthly meetings with different groups of chiefs from around the country. What are some of the issues that you're seeing? This one would have been one that could have been brought up. It's not like Farmington PD. We have 135 authorized. It's not like we could have done this study on our own. It would have been us bringing this to somebody else to say, hey, why don't you kind of look at a study of this? And then when they're looking at a bunch of different chiefs from around the country, oh yeah, we see a pattern. This is something that they're all kind of focused on. I think you've got subsequent questions to this, like both John and Eric are talking about, of, okay, what does this mean? What's the implication for training? And how do we begin implementing some of that? And is this just a 5 years down the road thing? I sure hope not. So I think the federal government could do more to help us. Yes, we're individuals at the local level, but the training more in the FAA style or even the hospital style coming from the DOJ. But what they need is a vehicle to have people like us talking to them. Here's the problems we're seeing out in the field. Help us look at that.
Yeah, for sure. Eric, any final words?
Definitely for final words, I just kind of want to give thank yous and some kudos. So again, the only reason this happened is because Chief Stephen Hebbe and Chief Jason Potts took the risk, right? Among the other chiefs that were willing to participate and gave us officers, not with a formal agreements. But that's the reality, right? You talk about these political environments, you talk about the risk that you take on when you shine the sunlight on, these questions. And both these chiefs did that. That's the reason why this research is standing up. I'd also like to give a quick acknowledgement to Marcus Diaz, because he was the on-scene person for Las Vegas Department of Public Safety and really had it running like a top. It's hard to get people through in 30-minute segments, and he ran that for us. I'd also like to acknowledge our other colleague, Dr. David Myers at the University of New Haven, for his work on the paper. I know he couldn't join us today, just because there's so many of us, but we definitely want to give him credit where credit's due. And then lastly, really is the men and women of all these departments. You mentioned earlier, and I didn't get a chance to get back to it, is what was their reaction afterwards? And I've never met more compassionate, empathetic, the finest of these agencies. Whatever decision was, they were not happy afterwards because they saw it was a cell phone, right? They really were hard on themselves about the decision-making process. And I know we got a little macro for a minute about training and the DOJ and all the background stuff, but I do want to end on a micro point of all this study is showing is that this happens, and that it appears to happen in that final frame. And it raises a larger question of, is there individual agency in that moment, right? Because a lot of what we're looking at tends to question that. And if it questions that, this isn't a study that's saying, hey, cops need necessarily all these different things. We're not saying there's anything wrong with cops. We're saying this is a natural phenomena that we can see, right? We add this variable and this happens. The next question is, what can we do on that chain to try and head it off before we get there? And to be honest, that's a million different research questions, as John and I are starting to kind of kick around, right? because we need to look at a number of things. We need to look at, how de-escalation works in it, how time distance cover works in it, in the final frame, how micro command works, physiology, right? So we can start looking at arousal levels. Like there's so many other questions really that need to build off and scaffold off this. So this is just a start. We invite everyone else in the country in this space to keep kind of probing this further.
Yeah, excellent points. John, as the sage of the group, I want to finish with you. Last words.
I think that's just a kind way of calling me old. But I think that going forward, I think that policing deserves its own research arm in the United States. And I think that if anyone is out there that wants to look into some problems, Eric and I are, we have both worn the uniform. We are now doing research. My career has spanned 50 years. And I think that we are both terrifically excited, as are other researchers. So don't be shy about giving us a call if you have something that you want to look into. One of the big problems for us is I know that Chief Hebbe and we got two monetary infusions. Chief Hebbe hosted us in New Mexico, and I know that Leeds paid for some of Eric's travel. Some of our research going forward is not anything that we could any longer pay for, because it includes equipment to study what's happening that's very expensive. So we're looking to collaborate with, the wonderful police departments out there and build answers and work together. We're excited about it, and we know that there are chiefs out there like Jason and Steve that want answers, and they need answers. And ultimately, as everyone has said, there are 700,000 cops out there that need to be able to do the best job that they could do, and we need to equip them to do that. So thanks for having us today, Jim. I really appreciate the time. I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate that you get stuff like this out there all the time. And good luck with your book.
Yes, thank you so much. And I want to thank each one of you not only for your contribution to the research and what you're doing here on a really important topic, but also every one of you are either current or prior law enforcement. John DeCarlo, Jason Potts, Steve Hebbe, and Eric Dlugolenski. I'm sorry. I got it all the way through till now. Dlugolenski. Thank you so much for what you're doing, past and present and in the future. Really important stuff. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, I've listed the link at the end in our show notes. Make sure you download the PDF, look at the research. There's a lot more than what we just talked about on the show today. And drop me a line. Let me know what you're thinking. policingmatters@policeone.com is our email. Drop me a line there, policingmatters@policeone.com. Really appreciate you listening. Hey, stay safe and be careful. And I hope to talk to you again real soon. Take good care.